everybody. My name's Fran Cafferatico. I'm a certified wildlife biologist, and I'm OFRI's, Oregon Forest Resources Institute, contract wildlife biologist. We're here today to talk about wildlife in managed forests and the important role that the family forest landowner plays for managing wildlife.
Happy to welcome folks to the Brown Family Tree Farm. Here we've got a chance to talk a little bit about the wildlife considerations, both in our management plan, but more importantly, in kind of the values we've come to appreciate from our tree farm.
One of the things that we really think is important for family forest landowners is to recognize that their property plays a role for wildlife, and every size forest matters for wildlife, and every age forest matters for wildlife. So no matter who you are and what size property you have the opportunity to create habitat for wildlife on your land.
We started out as a young family not really knowing what to expect. This was more of a long-term, maybe a retirement investment for us. And as the forest grew, our understanding grew about what we were able to do with the tree farm beyond just growing wood fiber.
One of the biggest things that landowners can do to provide for wildlife is to keep forest land in forestry. But just owning your property, you're doing a lot for wildlife already, and that's important to feel good about as a landowner. Snags are really important for wildlife, so we ask landowners to leave snags anytime they can. We recognize it can be a safety concern, and so if you have a place where small kids are going to be playing, or other machinery might be in the way, then I understand that. But if you can possibly keep snags across the landscape, we really ask for that. And then downed wood right along with that is really important. So anytime you see those big old stumps, or you have a really large downed log, try and keep those where they are and just really make sure that you protect those as you're doing your other management strategies.
Some of the things we've done up here include actually allowing this, as strange as it may seem, a forest pathogen to run its course. We have a few pockets of Phalinus root rot that have been slow enough that we really have not decided to fight it, because it's actually contributing snags and down wood at a rate at about what we'd like to see. So along with the snags that we've been left with because of the root rot that we've left, we've got snags that we've intentionally left and marked in various thinning operations. And it's been really rewarding to look and see those snags develop into really special habitat for a variety of woodpeckers. They put on quite a show.
Many of you know about the Oregon Forest Resources Institute and our program for helping landowners manage for wildlife. We have the Wildlife in Managed Forest program, and as part of that we have the Know Your Forest website. So it's literally just knowyourforest.org, and on there we put all kinds of publications and materials for landowners. So if you have a question about even managing for band-tailed pigeons, there's a publication on what that looks like. If you're interested in some of the tools and techniques for monitoring wildlife in your property, like how to install a game camera and what are the best ways for doing that, we have information on accomplishing that task. So if you can think of it, we probably have a publication that will answer your questions. Today at the Brown Family Tree Farm, we're going to head down into the woods and talk about a number of different sites and what's being accomplished here for wildlife. And what's cool about this property is it is unique. We have open areas, we have some older timber, some younger timber, a riparian area. So it's going to give us the opportunity to talk about a lot of different things that landowners can do for wildlife when you have these types of resources to work with. So I'm excited to get down in the woods and talk to everybody today.
This stand we're in is about 30 years old, and when we first bought the place, we found it completely overtopped with Scotch broom and blackberries and brush, and over time that developed into kind of a low, early seral stage forest that was pretty active with deer and elk and birds and insects. As this stand developed and it closed over at the canopy level, it really became a less dynamic, less active area, certainly performing habitat functions for certain species, but just not the dynamic kind of complexity that we'd like. So we came in here thinning where we could access the ground efficiently to open up some canopy areas, open up some patches, and select individual hardwoods to try and increase the diversity of this stand. And to where now we see a lot more activity from birds, insects. The deer and elk will hang in here and find something to eat as they move through.
You know, one of the things we like to talk about in any forest operation is how are you intentionally managing for wildlife? And I think thinning is a great time to think about that. And here, this was going to be a pre-commercial thin, and so what do you do with all the slash? So one of the kind of newer concepts we've been trying to talk to people about is piling the slash in an intentional way for wildlife. And so you can do that in a number of different ways. And one thing you can do is you can pile the logs together. So think you're trying to make a large log out of little logs. And the reason we do that is it decays a lot slower, and so it'll last on the landscape longer. Another thing you can do is pile it into a habitat pile. And so a habitat pile is, you think about like a log cabin. So you take the bigger pieces and you stack them together, and then you take the smaller pieces and pile them on top. And so there's a lot of different wildlife that will use these features. Quail will use the habitat pile. Bats will use a habitat pile. When you see them around, even like songbirds will come down and perch on the edge, and then they'll forage and then go back up. Anything that needs a place for cover or to den, we're trying to create those features across the landscape.
The opportunity that thinning buys you is to try and more closely mimic older forest characteristics. This is certainly not an old forest, but by adding the complexity, the open canopy patches, and managing for snags and down wood, you have a chance to kind of mimic some older forest characteristics that benefit wildlife.
So one of the things that the small landowners have the opportunity to do is to manage intentionally for wildlife on their landscape. And we think about the different ages of forest, and we know that young forests are really productive time, not only for the trees, but for wildlife. And older forests get a lot of press too. We know that, you know, those big trees are they're not only are they beautiful, but they're important for wildlife and homes for, cavity nesting birds. And so, but what about this age class in the middle? What about once the trees, close in? And that's such an important time as landowners to make some decisions for wildlife. And so some of the things you can do when you're thinning, you can selectively choose the hardwood trees to leave behind. That's really important for creating biological diversity and food source for wildlife. And then also when you are thinning those trees out, especially in a pre-commercial thin, like the one we're going to do here, then we would pile those specifically for wildlife. Every stage forest has critters that like to live there. That's why it's important to have a mosaic of all different ages of forest across the landscape. So when you have a patch of alder like this, it can be really important for wildlife. It can be an opportunity for creating diversity in the stand. And so, a lot of times we'll recommend leaving it, but we just really want to emphasize the importance of maintaining hardwoods across the landscape and how important that is for wildlife. So
we're in a stand here that when we bought the place would have been seen as just unproductive ground. This type of all hardwood component. We viewed this kind of stand as a patch of weeds, something to eradicate and replace with the rest of our 100% Doug fir planting objectives. As an alder stand, this is certainly kind of a better hangout for hoofed animals as they come through here. So we have that going on. If we do a patch cut here and interplant with this wider space in conifer, that kind of low canopy, younger seral age will be a great habitat for birds and insects and other ground feeding animals for quite a while. Special sites are a part of any wildlife management or forest management plan, and it can mean anything. And in this instance, the special site is the bluff behind us. And really what that means for wildlife is it's just an area that we'd choose to protect in the wildlife plan. We'd intentionally leave this nice buffer of trees around it. And we recognize that it's different from other places on the forest, and so we want to make sure we protect that. And you think, well, okay, who might be living in the bluff? And you can see that crevice behind me. Maybe there might be a bat roosting in there. There might be some of the salamanders that really use those rocky outcroppings. And then the adjacent forest around here too, it's a little bit older, bigger trees, a lot of cedar. And so we might have things like
red-shouldered hawk might find this place and call it home, or a northern flying squirrel, and we did see a Douglas squirrel as we walked in. So there's a number of species that would call this place home, and just because it's so different, we want to make sure we keep it on the landscape just like it is.
So this is one of our highest site ground locations. We're putting on a lot of fiber here every year, and it's a great savings account for us. This is not only putting on a little better than 6% a year in value, so it's a really good performing investment. Because it's putting on this much fiber, it's really a no-cost situation to leave snags, or while we're thinning, to manage for snags. So it's not only a wood fiber factory, it's a large wood snag factory for habitat up here.
Today we've been talking about priority actions for wildlife, and here in this 40-year-old stand there's a lot you can think about for wildlife, and one of the things is to identify your wildlife trees for future management. And one of the things we like to think about is and we talked about the legacy wood and legacy trees that we like to have across the landscape, and so now is a good time to identify which trees those are going to be and mark them as wildlife trees and leave them for future generations. These older stands are awesome, but we also want to have natural openings within the stand. And so as you hike through, you might look for a place where you can have a natural opening and maintain that, encourage understory growth, and encourage those hardwood trees and shrubs. Those are all things that are going to benefit wildlife in the long run.
So behind us is one of the root rot Phalinus pockets we've got on the place, and we're lucky these have moved pretty slowly. So this was about 14 years old when we bought the place, and since then, over the past 30 years, we've lost maybe 10 or 12 trees. So it's something we've decided not to manage in a kind of a traditional silvicultural sense for production purposes. It's really not taking up ground at a very fast rate, but it's contributing snags and pretty good sized down wood at a rate that's really helping here. One of the things we're looking for here is some significant open space to allow a bit of an understory. If we're lucky, we get some good fruit-bearing vegetation that makes a great habitat for example, a fan-tailed pigeon that just flew overhead just now.
There's always going to be winners and losers in wildlife, and so whatever action you take is going to benefit something. So you can feel good about the action that you take. I just would ask that you be intentional about it. So give some thought to what you want to see happen there. So as we're standing here in the riparian zone of the East Fork Dairy Creek, you can see that we have red alder, and we have big leaf maple, and we have Douglas fir trees, and there's a few openings too, and these openings provide a really good opportunity for maybe planting some more conifer species that we know will last a long time and persist across the landscape. So we might encourage a few cedars to grow here. Would be a really great addition to this riparian zone. And then behind me you can see this off-channel habitat area. You might find northwest salamander in here, or Pacific giant salamander. Seeing the logs go across it, we'd call those loafing logs in my world, and those are important if you're trying to encourage turtle. For us, over time, we've appreciated that rather than just a gray zone on the map, a place that's inoperable, we've started to look at these areas for opportunities. This site was largely just marsh ground in what historically would have been alternate river channel or beaver habitat that would have created some cold water resting refugia for salmon. We've come in and replicated that by digging this pond with partnership from our Tualatin River Watershed Council, the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, and OWEB. And this wood placement structure here is already performing just as intended, collecting gravels, collecting logs and sticks here. A little eddy has created a pool for just the kind of habitat the salmon are looking for. It's been a real pleasure to be out here on the Brown Family Tree Farm today talking about wildlife. And as we think about take-home messages, we just want to reiterate that having a mosaic of different habitats across the landscape does really good things for wildlife. Anytime you have a variety and a mosaic, then you're providing for a larger suite of species. So normally we have you all out on the tree farm with us, and we get to tell you about all the resources that are available. So we hope we get to see you all again soon. But in the meantime, we have the new OFRE Wildlife and Managed Forest publication, which is the Forest Says Habitat. And if you're thinking, oh, I've heard about that one before, you have, but we've completely revamped it. So this one talks a lot more about the priority actions for wildlife and how the family forest landowner can make a difference for wildlife. So we encourage everybody to take a look at this publication. And for other resources on how to manage for wildlife, we encourage you to go to the knowyourforest.org.